Hey, and welcome to the Weed Out, where we weed out the bullshit and talk about the nonsense in our backyard. My name's Spencer Fox Peterson, along with always my partner, Joanna.
Hi, everyone.
And this week we have our trusty journalist, Andrew, here to talk to us about records requests and specifically appeals. We discussed very broadly in the last episode. So we figured we should have Andrew back on to kind of go over that again and specifically about the appeals. And just I guess we'll start off. Joanna, how's your day going? And the same to you, Andrew. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. We got some snow here in Western Mass. I don't know about you guys, Andrew, out east, but
Yeah, same here. There was a little snow, not too crazy.
yeah, nothing crazy for me. It's a Tuesday for everyone listening, so not too crazy of a day. But I'm excited to talk records requests more with Andrew. We did talk about broader, just like Freedom of Information Act stuff, like Spence mentioned last time, and now we're gonna dive into like what happens once I say I made a request, and I know Andrew, you'll be able to walk us right through this. But like once I make a request and then I don't get a response or I don't get the response I want, then I can make an appeal. But so I guess like what is an appeal, and then when would I file one and all of that?
So yeah, when you have a problem with a records request with there's two options. One would be to file a lawsuit and the other would be to file an appeal. Um, the advantage of a lawsuit is that it's going to be heard by a court, which has, a lot more sort of authority and ability to get results. So a lawsuit is like sort of the in theory the best way of doing it. But the problem is that litigation, is very time consuming and expensive. I can tell you just from like my own experience trying to locate attorneys to do this kind of work, there's not that many of them who do it in the state of Massachusetts who litigate freedom of information stuff. Which, probably for a number of reasons. I think it's probably just that it's not going to make them a lot of money. People who want to fight these things in court typically are going to be looking for like pro bono representation. It's not like personal injury or civil rights or something where there's like, this pot of money waiting for you at the end. It's all you really get is the records, and you can also get the court to award your attorney's fees at the end. But obviously, an attorney is going to look at this and say, well, I might get money at the end, which could take years to fight this lawsuit in court. Or I could just go find some client who's going to pay me to do some different type of work, up front and probably more money. So, yeah, there just aren't that many lawyers who do this kind of thing, unfortunately. So, your next best bet is the appeal. And the the problem with the appeals is that there's an agency in the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office called the Public Records Division. It's headed by the Supervisor of Public Records, and this is the agency that will hear appeals, but it does not really have any sort of authority to enforce its will. It's not like a judge where it can like, send you to jail for contempt of court or whatever. It's just like Spencer last time compared it to like a hall monitor, which is sort of like apt. And like in fact, the supervisor can't even go to court and ask a judge to enforce what she says. She would have to refer it to the attorney general's office, which is something we might get into more later. But just know that as we go through this, we're going to be talking about how like cities and towns will just kind of blow off these orders. That's sort of like the root cause, is that the supervisor has limited authority. But the advantage of this is that it's a really simple and cheap process. Like you don't need to hire a lawyer. You can get results within, like weeks as opposed to like months or years sometimes. But basically just an appeal is when you write a letter to the supervisor of public records saying that the response to my request was inadequate for some reason, or it might actually be that the agency didn't respond to you at all. And sort of that's when you want to write one of these appeals. And we can kind of talk more about what goes into one as we continue to discuss this.
So
oh, sorry, Spence. I just wanted to thank Andrew because I didn't even know that lawsuits were an option. Definitely sounds more expensive and more difficult than the appeal process, though. But thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, definitely.
And Spence, what were you going to say?
I was going to jump in and remind everybody to go back, or if you're wondering who this position is, again, I wanted to double down on what Andrew reminded us. It's essentially a hall monitor. So it's kind of on an abolition podcast. It's kind of rich for us to be asking for like a cop, so I understand like that. This is a good compromise. Not everything has to be a knockdown, drag out fight, right? But my argument with this hall monitor is they have to have a little more power behind them. But regardless, I'm glad thank you for bringing that person back up, because that's the few people who've talked to me personally about that last episode. They're like, yeah, it's like kind of rich, about the hall monitor part. Like, it could be good and it could save us time and money, but it's just like everything else in Massachusetts state government. It's like, it's close, but no cigar.
Yeah.
And it costs this whole thing still, like, we have some of the highest tax rates in the country. So it's like, it's funny. We always joke about like progressive Massachusetts, but all the crazy stories that still come out of here, whether it's police killings, corruption, etc. I think it's fascinating that like we're so close to the point. It's almost like it's purposely not funded properly or set up properly to quite do what it's supposed to do. So it's like the illusion of transparency or taking on corruption. I don't know. That's just my personal flavor on it. So if anybody's ever like, I can't stand the Democrats because Democrats control Massachusetts and it's the same shit. Just looks a little different. I don't know. That's just my opinion. Please, either of you, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think you're talking about our tax rates. I promise that's not going to like making public records available,
No, absolutely. I was just more about it's like we have a lot of processes here in the state that are on paper a good idea, but they're not necessarily implemented in the most effective way. And it almost feels incompetence on purpose, like weaponized incompetence. I don't know. That's just my opinion when I hear these, when I learn more about the inner workings.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that this system could benefit from more resources. It seems like they don't have enough time to kind of consider a lot of the appeals as closely as they should be doing it. But that's kind of why you have to stay on top of things, which will be a theme, I guess, when you're making these. But yeah, like let me talk more about kind of how to go about doing these appeals, because I mean there's like three sort of like circumstances when you want to make one. One would be like if you don't get a response at all. You're supposed to get a response within 10 business days to a public records request. So if that doesn't happen, it's usually a good idea to file an appeal. And then the other sort of main things would be like you're appealing fees that are charged to you, or you're appealing when they withhold or redact documents, which we can get into in more detail. But some other sort of circumstances you might find are like, that they have a record, but they say that they don't, or that they can't find it or something. Like I've seen this where like the police department will have a policy that says we prepare a report on this like every year, like their use of force or something. And I'll be like, okay, give me that report. And they're like, we don't have it. And so you can point to the policy. And like you don't necessarily have to file an appeal about that. Sometimes it is better to just talk it out with the agency first and see if you can, get them to help you out. But like if they are not being responsive to you, you can file an appeal for something like that. And like another issue would be they say your request is too vague and they can't like understand what you're asking for, or that it's too broad and like they sort of know what you're asking for, but just the scope of it is like so ridiculous that it's not practical for them to comply. And there's sort of like two approaches to that. I mean, one is like work with them and maybe you can like narrow what you're asking for. If it's too broad, then it can help like sometimes to specify like specific dates for your request, like a range of dates that limits the amount of material you're going to be seeking, um, or things like that. Place limits on what you're requesting, and it might make it more practical. Um, and if it is too vague, I mean, just try to be more specific. But if you don't have the ability to be more specific, you can like reach out to the agency and say, hey, can you clarify like what um, or actually that's good advice sort of for both cases, asking them to clarify things. Like if they're saying something is too broad, you can ask them to sort of like clarify what sort of like range of materials are we talking about, and then maybe I can kind of narrow it down a little bit. Um, and if you're sort of not getting any assistance from them, you can file an appeal. I mean, technically, they're not obligated to answer your questions, but they are sort of like obligated to assist you. So it's sort of like a gray area. Like you can write an appeal over that. Um, but it's usually a good idea to try to like work with them a little bit first. But just remember that if they say they want you to narrow the scope of your request, you're not required to do that. Like if they think it's a lot of work, they still have to write like a fee estimate for you. They can't just be like, well, we don't want to do it because it's too hard. Like that's not really acceptable. So that's something that you could appeal.
Does the fee have to be like reasonable, Andrew, or could they come up with like what, like, could it be very, like, could they just state any number they wanted, or should it be based on like, amount of time that it takes? Or like, I have never had a fee imposed. I've had a department like say they would before, but then it never happened. So I just don't know what people should be looking for if they encountered fees.
Yeah, so there are limitations on the fees, which is like it's important to know some of these if you end up writing an appeal. Um, so the first thing people should know is that unless you're requesting records from a town with a population under 20,000, then you get some of the work for free automatically. I think it's like a city or town with a population above 20,000 has to give you 2 hours for free, and a state agency like the MBTA or the state police or something like that, they have to give you 4 hours free. And that's like per request. It's not like, per person. So each time you make a request, they're going to have to do some of it for free. And then sort of the two sources you get for fees is the search, which would be like them locating the records and making sure that it's the correct material and that it's all in order and that they're like making copies of it and stuff, scanning it if necessary. The other big source would be the redactions if they are redacting material, like blacking out information that is exempt. And there's a big sort of caveat to them being able to charge for the redactions, which it's important to know. Um, and that is that some redactions are required by law. Like say there's people's social security numbers or something, like they have to get rid of those. They can't give you a bunch of people's social security numbers. So they can charge you for that. But if they are redacting things that uh, they have discretion to redact but aren't required to, they cannot charge you for that. So
Okay.
like if they're saying something is, they're blacking out information because it's part of like a pending law enforcement investigation and it would jeopardize the investigation, that's like their discretion to decide that. So they cannot charge you money for it. And it's important to know that because I've seen this plenty of times where they'll come out with this big fee and they're saying, oh, we have to review all these records for these redactions. And like most of it or all of it is exemptions that are like discretionary. And, you should appeal those. Um, and then the other big thing that everyone should know, like, remember this, if they don't respond to you in 10 days, they cannot, in 10 business days, they cannot charge you a fee. So if the initial response is not given to you in a timely manner, then any records you request are free no matter how much work it costs. And if they try to charge you a fee, despite not getting to you in time, then you can appeal that fee.
Awesome to know. And the other thing I have seen, so I'm going to ask you about this. I've requested stuff. An agency has ignored me, and I know the 10-day rule, but a few times they've responded like right before, like say day 9, and then they'll be like, "This is a very timely process, like one, so we are going to like invoke or whatever, like our 25 days because it's a more involved." And I remember having to maybe ask you about that too. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so they're supposed to respond to you in writing within 10 business days, but they have up to like 25 business days to actually provide the records. And
Okay.
technically they're supposed to provide the records as soon as possible, and they're not supposed to like delay and take 25 business days just because they feel like it.
Okay.
But sort of like there's no real way to appeal this. Like if you say, oh, they said they need 25 business days, but they don't really, it's simple, it's just a one file that they need to, attach to an email. The supervisor of records, it like won't tell them to speed it up. And like um also like it's sort of like it can take up to 10 business days to get your decision from the supervisor. So like at that point, like it doesn't matter anyway, basically. Like it's sort of there's sort of like no real mechanism to prevent them from misusing that. And I see that like so you should know that just because they're going to take 25 business days, it doesn't mean that they can delay responding to your request. Like
Okay.
the elements of a written response to a request are not just saying, oh, don't worry, we're going to get you the records within 25 business days. Like they're supposed to say approximately when they will be getting you the records. They're supposed to let you know if they're exempting any of the records. They're supposed to sort of tell you what they actually have. They're supposed to give you an explanation for why it's taking more than 10 business days. Like all of this stuff is supposed to be in there, but sort of in my experience, they often will just skip that, and it's probably because there's no real like punishment if they do.
Yeah.
So, um, but if they do like write you a response like that where they say, oh, this is going to take longer, and then on day 25 they're like, oh, well, here's a big fee. That they're not allowed to do. The fee should
Okay.
be in the first letter within 10 business days.
Okay. Good to
So
know
that,
too.
yeah.
Thank you. I think the fee thing may scare some people, so I think it's good to know like what your maybe options are and that it may not actually be that much money. I know in the past, like I've had, to pay a small fee for printing and stuff, but it wasn't anything crazy. And most times in any agency that I have contacted personally, and I don't do a ton of records requests, I haven't had any fees requests.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the limitations it placed in the law are fairly effective. And unfortunately, it's also the case that a lot of them will ignore um, the 10-day deadline, and so we'll end up like not being allowed to charge fees anyway. Um, but also just to clarify for people, when we talk about fees, it's not like you write the request and then suddenly, like you owe them all this money and like, they're going to put a lien on your house if you don't pay them or something, like
Right.
it's like you write the request, they have to give you this estimate like at no charge, and then you decide whether or not you want to pay them. And if it's too much money, you can, fight it like in with an appeal. Or if it ultimately, they have a just reason for charging you the fee, and you uh and you can't pay it or don't want to pay it, you don't have to. Like it's not like you're on the hook for this money, just because you requested the records. Just like know that like the in terms of avoiding fees, the other advice is just to not make your request like over broad. Like you don't want to
Yeah.
limit it to exclude things that are important for whatever, your purposes are, but you also don't want to make it so broad that they have an actual reason to charge you a bunch of fees. So like if you can narrow it in some way, it's best to do that.
Absolutely. And I wondered, Andrew, like for just for the audience, do you write the letters of appeal to the office of the Secretary of State, do you write those in like an email form? Do you do it directly to an office? Like I usually try to find an online way, either email or like a form that a town or city has if it's an option. So I just wanted people to know that it can be done digitally, but I wondered if you see often that you have to send things in physically as well.
You can do it through the mail, and in fact, I used to do it that way, but I would not recommend it. It's better to do everything through email. It's just faster, and like you know that they received an email, whereas like things can get lost in the mail, and like it takes longer for people to receive things, which can add time onto the process, especially like if you end up having a big thing where there's like a request and back and forth and multiple appeals and like that, just adding like a few days to each part of the process would like really add up, and you
Totally.
might you might not know if somebody didn't like receive a letter or something. So it's just better to do everything by email. And
Awesome.
just the you send these appeals to the Secretary of State's office through um if you search for Massachusetts Public Records Appeal, like the first page is a page on the Secretary of the Commonwealth's website, and they have the email. I think there's also like you can mail it or fax it, but I would do it by email. And you also just have to make sure you send your appeal to the agency too. They have to receive a copy of the appeal, or it's not considered like a valid appeal. And you also have to make sure that you attach a copy of your original request to the appeal, um, which I've forgotten that so many times when like all these like
Me
agencies
too.
will start like a new email thread because they can't like just keep it together. I hate it when that happens. So like I end up forgetting to attach it, and they'll email me and be like, "Where's the request?" And I'll have to go track it down. But yeah, just it's not a big deal if you forget. They'll ask you about it, but just try to remember. Um, but yeah, that
Assume the government doesn't know what the left hand is doing and that they use that as plausible deniability. We're not trying to withhold records. We're just, I'm a different agent dealing with this email or whatever, however it works, and so it kind of works in their favor. This is what I'm hearing, and they can kind of weaponize that unintentionally or intentionally. Doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I mean, I had like to go back to the mail thing. I did have cases where people said they didn't receive things in the mail, and like maybe, but I definitely wondered, like, are you sure about that? You sure you didn't just throw it in the garbage, or maybe it just went to the wrong person and they didn't know what to do with it or something? So,
I mean, unless you're going to pay certified mail and have to get a
Right.
signature, and
yeah,
that,
which is such a waste of money. Just use
Right.
email. Seriously.
Yeah. Well, like that's why I wanted the audience to know because the email is nice to be able to use. So
but always assume when you're dealing with them an email that you're ultra clear and because you're going to assume that somebody else is reading the email thread and then they're accidentally starting a new one because so and so who's been working there for 40 years doesn't know how to do the emails.
Yeah, and also like people sometimes ask you to talk on the phone with them. It's okay, like I've done this plenty of times before, to just say if you have questions, please put them in writing. Um, like because I mean I do talk to people on the phone about records requests sometimes, but usually I just feel like it's better to do it through writing because then there's no confusion about who said what and when they said it and everything. So it's just I think it's like more practical. I mean, don't feel free to talk to people on the phone, but I think it's often better to keep things in writing because you can't sort of like it's more difficult to raise it, like in an appeal if you don't know exactly what somebody said.
absolutely, that's really good advice to have that paper trail, especially when you're dealing with records requests in general. But overall, I think, and I do wonder. It's not a wonder. I've had actually pretty decent interactions when I've done appeals at the state level. Like they do respond usually pretty quickly very limited experience and try to be helpful. And I always forget to attach my original stuff too. And they're always super nice. They just like you said. So anyone who's going, not a seasoned person in records requests, like everyone at the state level who is reaching out as kind of like almost like an analyst that's going to be helping you work through that process, they are very understanding that you may not know what exactly to do. So like they'll reach out with like to clarify or get more information from you or ask for the documents you may have forgot to attach. So it isn't as, I guess, daunting as it may sound.
And
Yeah, and speaking, if speaking of the people in the Secretary of State's office at the Public Records Division, if you call them, they will like explain to you things about how the process works. Like if you have questions, they
Yeah.
have like an on-call lawyer every day, I think. It's not on the same page I mentioned before. If you go to the Secretary of the Commonwealth website and you go to About Us and then Contact Us, the public records, there's like a phone number. And if you call that number, they will respond to you, and they will assist you with any questions you have, like about the process. Like they are very helpful.
I found that too.
I want to remind the audience, like this is specific to Massachusetts. Every state is going to
Yeah.
have their
Yeah.
different processes and procedures and where the information is located. And then there's also the federal level, the Freedom of Information Act, which I think is mostly done through online portals. I've never done anything FOIA that's not an online portal, but I should have known that before I opened my mouth about it. Do you have anything to say about that? It's a little bit of a tangent, but
Well, just so
Sure.
people know, like you're saying, every state has a freedom of information law, but they're all different. Like the particulars of like how long people have to respond, or like what you do if you don't get the records, like it's all different. And then the federal system is governed by the Freedom of Information Act, which is different. Even if it's like Massachusetts related, if it's by the federal government, that's a different law. So everything we're talking about applies to like cities and towns in Massachusetts and Massachusetts state agencies. It does not apply to any federal agencies in Massachusetts, and it doesn't apply to any other state. So you'll have to look up. I know the website Muckrock, which is a great site. It's actually the HQ is in Massachusetts, I think, still, and they help people make records requests all throughout the country and at the federal level. They have like information about, I think, every state. It's been a while since I looked at it. I'm not sure how up to date it is, but they should have some information there. Or they probably have links to resources in different states. If anybody listening is interested in learning about a different state or about the federal requests, they're a great organization.
Awesome. Andrew, I wondered, because you've provided me with one, but you don't have to share it. If you would be willing, like if I could post maybe like a template of language people may want to use when they make a request and the first court request, but I've never seen like what you write to the appeal department either. So I would like personally like to see that, but I would love to even just make people a basic template for requests in general. But I don't know how you feel about that, but I know that for me it's very I know some people cannot like get worried about what to say or how to say it. So when you sent me the information you did in the past, it was super helpful. So I was wondering if maybe on the website, and I will include all of the other things we've mentioned, like the websites from the state and how to get access to the lawyer and the agencies to help you if you do make an appeal. But I wondered if you thought templates would be an option we could maybe do.
So templates for requests, there is one on the Secretary of the Commonwealth website
Awesome.
already,
Okay,
which
I'll link to that then.
and I think Muckrock has templates they have for like Massachusetts and every other state.
Awesome.
But I do use my own template because I like to have it, my special way. In fact, I use voice recognition software. I started doing that because I have like problems with pain in my wrists. So I like have a template where I just like say a voice command and it like brings up my template, which
Ooh,
you should
fancy.
you should try it. Yeah, if you have
I like
the
that.
time to learn how to use Dragon voice recognition software. Um, but Yeah, it's a good idea to have a template, even if you like know what you're doing, just because it saves a lot of time not to have to write the whole, same thing over and over again. Um, because like it helps to put certain pieces of information in it. Just and it just saves a lot of time. Like I've always used the template, like, for most of the time that I've been doing this.
Awesome. It was such a helpful thing when you shared that with me. And I guess as we move forward with things like say so if the Secretary of State, the agent maybe that's working with me, like what time for do they have a time frame in their response to me? And then will they, I know we've talked in past episodes that they can't make an agency give us records, but do they come up with a finding? Like how do we find to determine like when do they and what do they say? All of that.
So they do have a time limit. It's 10 business days, just like with the request. Um, and there used to not be a time limit. That they changed
Okay.
that in a law that was passed in 2016, and it used to be so bad it would take like months, and it was awful. Like it was so slow that like sometimes it felt like, is this even worth it? Just because like, you want to be able to get records in a timely manner so that you can talk about things that are newsworthy now. um, and like when it automatically adds on like 2 to 3 months just because the agency, like didn't respond to you or something, like it's such a pain.
Can
um
we give something contextual, like is there a specific story that you can think of recently or in your reporting that's like, wow, you held out on that information and that guy some, like, kind of like when George Floyd happened, the same thing happens in Massachusetts. There's a rush to get background information in the actors involved, and you find a detail out that you were looking into a while later that would have been helpful to know when the iron was hot. Does that question make sense?
um yeah, I mean, I guess one good example would be the story that we talked about the first time I was on here. I talked
Awesome.
about this police brutality incident, uh allegations that this woman was knocked unconscious when she was thrown headfirst into a police cruiser. Um, and I initially got a bunch of information about it from the district attorney's office, but what I sort of needed to fully report the story was this information from a state police investigation. And the district attorney's office claimed that it did not have this information. Like, I guess from it was a little hard to understand, but I guess the state police hadn't turned it over or something. I don't know, why they ended up ultimately turning it over, because it seemed like the investigation had been, closed for a while. Um, but the state police would not give me access to the information, and it was only because I appealed the state police a few times, and they took this position that they didn't have to give me any of the information multiple times. But I sort of kept on the Berkshire DA's office, like, do you have these other records? Like, why don't you have them? I thought this investigation was complete, like, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually the DA's office did turn over the records to me. But, to this day, the state police won't give me the records. So like that's a great example where this story I would have had all the information possibly months earlier if this other agency had been, interpreting the law the same way that a different agency was. So like, yeah, that's a great example. Like, um, just and that story at the time was already fairly old. I had only kind of, found out about it, by like digging around. So like I think that it really does sort of impact the ability of the media to cover stories, particularly ones that people, don't want to get out.
Absolutely.
That are so, like, we had a recent episode with Laura Saylor of the Workers' Party, and her whole experience with Sandra Birchmore, and she's been doing a rally cry about getting more information about these officers. Why are they getting hired? Why are they being recertified by Post, specifically Officer Healy? I believe. I think he's an SRO or something now. Anyways, not to sidetrack too much, but this information, when people like Kirk Minahan were doing his podcast on Sandra Birchmore or any other journalist locally, they would have more information sooner and people's attention would have been kept on it. And it sucks that the American attention span and just in the global capitalist sphere we're all in, it sucks that we don't have an attention span for too long. I mean, Tyree Nichols happened like a month ago, and there's nothing really other than the black officers were fired immediately and then held at a really high bond. And so here we are, rinse repeat, but they get to be like, oh, we did justice. It's like, well, we know why you did justice.
But I don't know. I don't know if we know at the ground level or within there. For me, I think they may be like, there may be like independent, the mainstream media. I totally agree with you, Spence. I'm not saying you're off base there at all. But I think independent journalists though,
well, we don't have the money.
Well, no, I agree, but Andrew had said it at the beginning, and I'm at this. This is a easy point, and I'm sure Andrew would agree, and you will too. I know it's hard to be persistent, but in these cases, like, it's about that. So like I would check back sometimes after, like, and I did, and like Andrew mentioned, working with the agency if you can a little bit and stuff like that. And there may be community activists, and I'd hope in every town where things like you've mentioned are happening, who are doing those things. But yes, they may not be getting as easy access, and it may take a longer time for them to report on it, which is I think detrimental to everyone. We should have information and be able to understand what's going on in our communities. And that's why these episodes are so important to me. This information is so interesting, in my opinion. And I think these things are so important for every citizen to know so that you can understand what the law is and what your rights are.
And this isn't just about police. This is about health departments.
Yes, could be
anything.
Yeah.
Like, your tax, I hate this, but our tax dollars. But these things affect us. We're governed by them, and it's important. It's not just about the money. It's about that this is our society, and can we do this better?
Yeah, and I mean, don't feel shy like making these requests. Like, they're called public records because they belong to everyone, and like, this is part of the government's job. Like, it's a law that they're supposed to follow. So like, don't feel like you're imposing, because you ask to see information. Like, you have the right to do it, and it's worth doing. Like, you can uncover like really important things that otherwise people wouldn't know about by doing this. And it can be difficult to be persistent. Like, you have to keep reminding yourself, but they're like counting on that you'll go, on the fact that like a lot of people will go away. Like, it
Exactly. So if you are persistent, I have seen results. So that's my advice for sure too.
Absolutely, yeah. And like, you may not get the records every single time. Unfortunately, there are problems with the law that like they can get away with things if they want to, but like, if you will get more stuff, like, at least some of the time. So it's worth trying.
What would happen if, say, the agency told the health department or the police department that I requested from that they needed to give me the records, and then that police department or health agency just refused? Do I have it? Like, can I appeal that? Do I keep appealing?
So sort of the way the process works is like the supervisor. So like, normally if you actually get a response and they aren't going to give you the records, or they give you the records and they're like redacted and you think that the redactions are excessive, you can challenge that, and the supervisor will sort of look at the letter that they sent you.
Okay.
And when they exempt records, like either completely or partially, they have to cite exemptions to the public records law. There's like, I can't remember the exact number. It's like around, is it like 24 or so? But there's exemption A. It goes up to V, A through V.
Okay.
Exemption A is like if there's another law outside of the public records law that exempts it, they can like cite that law through exemption A. And then there's also like specific exemptions, like exemption C is the privacy exemption. So um, there's like there's a policy making discussion exemption. There's a law enforcement investigations exemption. There's a bunch of exemptions, but these exemptions are like they're designed to be read narrowly. So like they're vague so that they can be applied to different things for the most part, but they're still meant to be read narrowly. And so like you should read the language of them. And there's also a guide to the public records law on the Secretary of the Commonwealth's website, which has a lot of information um, about these exemptions, and it's really worth reading through that. You don't have to like read the whole thing, you know, from like cover to cover the first time, but like if you're trying to appeal something, it's really helpful to go in and if they cite exemption C, go read what it says about exemption C and kind of like remind yourself that, you know, like the first few times until you sort of understand how the exemption works. And like you have to look at the language of the exemption, and there can be like court decisions that have sort of defined more clearly what it means, and some of that stuff is in the guide. I think unfortunately it's out of date in certain ways, but there's still tons of useful information in here. It's really helpful. Um, and like one example would be like the privacy exemption can exempt medical information, but it only counts if it's connected to a like identifiable person. So like if they can if you don't know the name of the person that the records are about, then they could redact that person's name and then you can get the medical information. But since it's not linked to a particular person, you can get that information. Whereas if the records are kind of concerning someone that, you know, we know who it is and they're not going to redact the name, then they might be able to redact the medical information. So like you want to pay attention to things like that. And like, you know, the law enforcement investigation applies to uh well actually let me clarify this. So when they write these letters, they have to cite an exemption and they also have to explain how the exemption applies to the records. And often what you'll get is just boilerplate language, like they'll just kind of copy paste the definition from the statute, and like they'll be like it's an ongoing investigation, and they'll, you know, copy paste the investigatory exemption. But like they don't have to go into like a crazy amount of detail, but they have to at least sort of explain generally how releasing the information would, you know, uh, actually prejudice the law enforcement investigation, because that's what the exemption says. It doesn't say any information from an ongoing investigation. It says that it has to have a likelihood that it will prejudice the investigation somehow. And like it also has, that means it also has to be like an ongoing thing. Like if it's a closed case, then they shouldn't be citing this exemption generally. But there's a lot of things like that in the public records law where it's very helpful to read the exemption carefully and read the language. Um, and like I would also say that people should, if you're not sure, then file an appeal. Like you might think like, oh man, that does sound like it might be exempt, I guess I should give up. Like if you've never encountered this issue before and filed an appeal about it, like file an appeal, because you might be surprised. Like I have filed appeals where I was like, I don't know if this is going to go my way, but it did.
Awesome.
And like one example would be there's this law that exempts police reports of domestic violence, right? So I was like, okay, well, I found out that these police officers had been arrested for alleged domestic violence. So I filed requests
Yep.
asking for the reports, like the police reports, and also for like the internal affairs investigations that were done. And I think in every single case I was like denied these records under this law.
This is a
But
good time to remind everybody, Google 40% of cops. It's a fascinating study. It has to do with 40% of cops self-reporting and their families.
yes, well, more than 40% of cops will cite this law to cover up domestic violence, but 100% of them will. But anyway,
Oh, that's good.
what I appealed these, and what I found was something interesting, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. This was that the supervisor said, if it's like an arrest report, like if the police showed up to his home and arrested him for domestic violence, yeah, that's like covered by this law. But if it was an internal investigation, that's like that's like a police thing. It's not a like a criminal thing, and so this law doesn't apply to it. And so she had this like she had like sort of a more narrow definition of this law than the police obviously had. But like that's a good example of like, if you're not sure, file an appeal. Like if it's the first time you've seen something, file an appeal, just because like the people at the supervisor's office, they're lawyers, so like they may be familiar with things that you're not, and also they may just have like a particular interpretation of the law that, even if it hasn't been like tested in court yet, it's the position they're taking, and it may convince people to turn over records. So like, yeah, always file an appeal, and also don't be like super intimidated. Like you don't have to necessarily explain what's wrong. You can say like, they cited this exemption and they didn't explain with enough specificity how it applies to the records. Or you like just say like, I'm not sure that their legal argument makes sense. Like if you're not sure, like you can do that. Like, and the
Weaponize your ignorance.
yeah, like the people in the supervisor's office, they're lawyers and they're going to do their lawyer thing, whether you do or not. Like they're kind of forgiving and understanding of, the fact that this is like a more informal process. Like it's not like if you go to a judge with like a handwritten note that's like they screwed up, like he's gonna be like, what is this? Like, dismissed. But if you do the same sort of thing with them, like they're gonna be like, okay, we'll take a look at this and see what we can do. Um,
Nice.
yeah,
And
but
good to know, because I found the first time I got some of the exemption language back, I just want people to know, and I'm an anxious person, so there's some people out there like me, maybe I got intimidated at first. And then Andrew actually and Spence were both like, no. And then Andrew kind of, you directed me to be like, no, like these exemptions, and showed me that stuff. So I think for people, like it seems when you get the exemptions back, the language is sometimes very confusing if you're not a lawyer, or if it sounds like, okay, I've lost this endeavor, I can't get these records. It's really good to know that even if I just didn't understand, I could still appeal and ask, like, I'm not sure about this
yeah,
and stuff
definitely.
like
I mean,
that.
like anytime a person who's not like familiar with something or isn't a lawyer starts reading legal language, they're like, oh my God, like what? Like, you know, this there must be a law against whatever it is I'm doing. But no, like often, like it is extremely common for them to just misuse these things and claim these totally overbroad things. And like sometimes the language, the first time you read it, like you may not sort of understand what it means or what the context is, or like you may not be aware. Yeah, so there just may be things you're not aware of that, like some people, like another police thing is like when you're requesting internal affairs records, police have said that like, oh, those are personnel records, so it's like a privacy exemption thing. There's like a personnel exemption. um, but no, there's a court case about this specific issue from like 20 years ago where they said no, internal affairs records are not the same thing as like an employee evaluation. Like it's something that is to ensure, that we have like a, system of policing that, has integrity that people can trust, which I would question whether it is a sufficient, system, but that's like the purpose of it. So people should have access to those records. And so like if they say that those are personnel records, like you might read the language and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I guess they're exempt. But no, like there's often like context to the language that you read. So like, you know, you should read, you know, the guide and the to see if it has more context, and you should just file an appeal if you're not sure.
Awesome. Good to know.
And I want to take this opportunity, though, real quick, to share with the audience and Andrew, peel back the curtain a little bit between Joanna and I. She just mentioned like she's like sometimes she gets anxious about the response from whatever, and I'm the one who's cheering her on. That's true. The reason I'm cheering her on is because she's by far a better, more level-headed and calmer writer than me and communicator. So of course I'm going to cheer this person on. You know, they're like, I'm
Thank
pretty
you,
sure,
Spence.
like, if it was me alone talking to these people asking for stuff, I don't know if we got this so far. We're like a good marinade, you know, sweet and sour. So you know,
Yeah, and
I
actually
just want to make sure Joanna gets more credit. She's
Thank you.
and
I appreciate that.
and speaking of that, like if you're making records requests, like you're not alone. Like you may if you like just try it on your own and like have questions, there are so many people out there like who will talk to you. Like I talk to people about this stuff, like, and you know, when I was less experienced, there were like reporters, I would be like, hey, can you show me your template, or hey, could you how did you write this type of request, and like, hey, could you show me, you know, how you did this. And it's very rare for someone to be like, you know, no, I don't have time to talk to you. Who are you? You know, why are you bothering me? Like people who do this kind of thing, like care about transparency and openness. And so they're going to be, for the most part, like open with other people, and they're going to help people. Um, and again, also you can call the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office, because the lawyers there, they will help you with things too. Like if you have procedural questions, like they will give you advice, just about like sort of the best way to do the appeal. And like, yeah, it can be helpful to talk with them too. But yeah, just know that there are journalists and activists and other people out there. You know, you can find them on Twitter or whatever. And
yeah, this is a good time to remind everybody, if you don't feel comfortable doing this, or your life is just busy as hell, any way you can support journalists that are doing this work like Andrew, since we're having him on here, of course we're gonna like highlight this particular journalist, but anybody you know doing this work, and you read their work and you feel like it's offering you information and giving you a point of view that you think is important, or uncovering information that's relevant to, you know, things governing our existence. So, you know, you can support with money, you can support by just subscribing so the algorithm is a little more friendly, rating, all that stuff. So, you know, go to our website, theweedout.com. We'll link to Andrew there, as always. And you know, this is, it doesn't, we don't all have to be journalists, but hey, you know, at least with this information, you know, you listen to this episode, maybe you'll feel like you learned something, share it with somebody that might be keen on this, that might just feel overwhelmed by the process, and then remind them there's also a community out there that we want this information for the good of everybody. So of course we're probably going to be a little, there's no gatekeeping here. We need to work together. So thank you, Andrew, and we really appreciate that you do this work.
thanks, definitely.
Do you want to stick around for ghoulery and tomfoolery?
I mean, do we have more time to talk about the appeal stuff? Because there is more stuff I would mention.
Yeah,
Sure,
let's go.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I another thing people might want to know about is like attorney-client privilege, because there's like sort of a unique thing here. Like you might think that the government, like we're in theory the government represents us, so like lawyers who represent the government should be our lawyers, right? But actually, and that there should be no like attorney-client privilege, but actually for some reason there is attorney-client privilege. Like the government can hide things from you by saying that it's like, you know, attorney advice. But if you're doing a public records request, they have to produce a log for you. So like if they say they have all these records with their attorney-client privilege, they have to produce a log that lists each document, that says who wrote the document and who they sent it to, and they have to give you like the date of the document, and they have to give you sort of like, they don't have to like summarize the information in the document, but they have to give you like some idea of what it is about. And like it can be really helpful to do that because like um it can get you some information. Like even if you don't get the records, you can find out like how much communication was going on and sort of like generally what they were talking about. So that's like something people might want to be aware of. um and like you had asked earlier, what happens like if an agency doesn't comply with the supervisor of records? So there's sort of like two answers to that. Like it sort of depends. Like the supervisor is going to say that typically the supervisor will not say like these are public records and you must produce them. They will say um, that it's not clear if the agency, if the exemptions like actually apply, and the agency needs to provide more information. And you know, sometimes the agency will be like, okay, we don't have a legitimate argument here, but often they will just provide like a more detailed denial that it's like the same exemptions, but they'll provide a slightly more detailed legal argument. And actually in some cases they will literally just be like, well, we don't agree and we think our argument is fine and we're not gonna like, we just don't want to release the records. Um, so like if they just kind of double down, you can file an appeal. And unfortunately, often what happens is your appeal will just get closed if they say that they're going to write a new response. It's really obnoxious. And then
Yeah.
you might get one of these responses where they just basically say the same thing over and again, and it's really frustrating because it just like slows everything down. But you can appeal that. But sort of the other answer I was mentioning is that sometimes an agency will like literally they'll get an order from the supervisor and they just won't respond. They'll just like totally ignore the order. They'll ignore you. They'll just like stop communicating. And when that happens,
Just
you
new
have
who this on you, like new phone who dis.
Yeah, I mean, when that happens, it used to be that you could file another appeal, but they sort of changed their procedure to now it's like if they don't comply with the process at all, like they're just not corresponding with you, they have this position at the public records division called this compliance supervisor, which is like sort of ironic because they haven't given her a staff to help her with this process. So like she's not really a supervisor. Um, and she also can't really do much to get them to comply because again, like she doesn't have any additional power. She's basically a mediator. Like she'll kind of reach out to the agencies and be like, hey, we're kind of serious about this. You need to respond to our thing here. And if sometimes, yeah, she'll get people to she's helped me get like people to respond. Sometimes again they just write more denials. Sometimes I've gotten records from doing this, and uh other times she can't get an answer from them either. And when that happens, the supervisor will write, they call it like a second order, I think, like basically just being like, hey, if you don't do this, we're going to possibly involve the attorney general's office. um and the attorney general's office is sort of like the last step. Basically, the attorney general's office, typically the supervisor will not refer things to the attorney general's office because like I have things that have been like sitting in the supervisor's lap for months, and I don't know, they're just kind of like in limbo. Like I don't know if they're going to be referred to the attorney general or not. And I think there's sort of like a good reason why the supervisor doesn't rely too much on the attorney general. It's because kind of like historically, the attorney general's office has often disagreed with the interpretation of the law from the supervisor of records. And like, there's probably different reasons for that. I mean, the supervisor is like an appointed person, the who's like a kind of like a bureaucrat basically, whereas the attorney general is like a elected, position. It's also a law enforcement position. The attorney general is a cop. And then also, uh, probably the biggest thing is that the attorney general's office is like responsible for defending state agencies in court. So like think about it. If a state agency doesn't want to turn over records, you're asking the same person who would be responsible for like defending that agency in other cases to go and sue that agency. And
Defend itself from itself.
yeah, and in some cases the attorney general's office has defended state agencies in public records lawsuits too. And they I did a piece about sort of public records policy during the election last year, and I had reached out to the attorney general's office, and they kind of said to me, this is not really a conflict of interest because we have like different people in the office doing the public record stuff. They're like in a separate division from the litigation people who are doing all the defense work. And I was my perception of that is like, no, like they have the same boss. Like it doesn't matter, like the same person is like handing down policy from on high, and so it doesn't matter as long as they work for the same office. Like there you at least people have like a perception, a reasonable a reason for perceiving that there's a conflict of interest. Like they can't just like I just don't think it's a good system for having these same agencies. I think it should be the supervisor of records that handles these things, should be allowed to enforce her decisions in court. But just to sort of get back on topic, like my point is that this is a fairly rare thing. Like it's not rare for an agency to ignore someone's public records request, but it's rare for something to get referred to the attorney general's office. But when it does, the attorney general's office will avoid filing a lawsuit. They will try to mediate things. They'll kind of say, hey, this is how we see the law, and you better comply with what we're saying, or there could be further legal action. And often, I think this often works when they do it. There have been, I think, only 2 cases where the attorney general's office like in the entire history of the public records law, or at least the modern public records law, has actually sued over public record stuff. Those were both under Maura Healey, but again, just 2 out of, I think, somewhere there's close to like 2,500 to 3,000 appeals filed every year for the last few years. So for thousands of appeals to have only resulted in 2 lawsuits, when like it just kind of shows that it's a weak system. I mean, there are only a handful of public records lawsuits filed each year, but certainly like media organizations, like particularly the Boston Globe, and also like the ACLU of Massachusetts, they file more of these public records lawsuits than the attorney general's office. Even though the attorney general's office, theoretically could be investing lots of resources in this if it was something that they valued. But I think that it just shows that they don't value it, and we shouldn't sort of rely on them to be the answer. I mean, if you can't get an answer from, through the appeals process, then you're probably better off trying to file a lawsuit than relying on the attorney general's office. But like I was saying earlier, that is not necessarily going to pan out either. But I mean, it just shows the importance of having like a strong public records law, and it shows that even though we passed a big update a few years ago, there's like still so much left to do in terms of public records reform, like we were talking about last episode.
Absolutely. And it's also, let's consider, the fact that our current governor, Maura Healey, like you mentioned, what was formerly a top cop who appoints people to these bureaucratic positions, likely that are right. She would appoint the secretary of records, I would assume.
No, that's the person who does the appeal is the supervisor of records. That's appointed by the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So it's been
Oh,
William. That's been William Galvin for the past like 30 years. But the Attorney General's office certainly is appointing the person in her office who is going to decide whether or not they're going to sue these agencies that withhold records, and
yeah,
also appointing the people who are defending the state agencies.
yeah, and I would also just like to point out, like, the AG, Maura Healey, when she was AG, there wasn't too much friction that I could see between her and the Baker administration. Being Baker was a Republican, so she's probably doing the good bidding for big business, cop watch style anyways. And then, or the person that's now AG, I think was her somehow. They had worked together. There's some connection there. So, and it's just interesting about, like, we just keep promoting cops, and that's really, at the end of the day, I just don't understand why people of power in our generation, everybody that keeps rising the ranks, whether it's Maura Healey or Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, they're just cops, and they're just getting elected to higher and higher positions. It's really depressing. I want other people to be involved in politics than police officers and lawyers.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I just remembered one other piece of advice that people might find really helpful about the exemptions. So there's something called an in-camera inspection. This is like a Latin term. It has nothing to do with cameras or photography. It means like in chambers. It's like basically it just means like a private inspection of records. And this is like a term they would use like when a judge is reviewing records in chambers, like away from the attorneys, like but in the context of the appeals, the supervisor can order an in-camera inspection of records. So basically she will get an unredacted copy of the records from the agency. You will not have access to this copy. It's purely for her or one of her attorneys to review. So like there's no loophole where suddenly she has a copy of it and now she can, hand it over to you. But they will review the records and make a decision about whether the agency has cited the exemption properly. And there's sort of like this is something you can request, but like you don't typically want to request it in your first appeal necessarily. It's like when the agency doubles down on something, they're like citing the same exemptions over and over again. You should be like, oh well, they won't change their mind, so I think that you should, order an in-camera inspection and look at it yourself and decide whether this is exempt. Sort of the one caveat to it is like if you already like know what you're arguing about, like say they redact people's names from the records, like the supervisor reviewing the people's names like adds no information. Like you already know that their names, like just seeing that they're who the names are doesn't really tell you anything. So like that's a situation where it doesn't benefit you to order to ask for an in-camera inspection. It's only sort of like if the agency blacks out like a whole bunch of text and like you don't really know what it is, like if they're saying, oh, this is medical information, but you sort of are like skeptical of it, or they're saying, oh, it's private, or whatever, they're citing some exemption to like black out, like a sentence or a paragraph or a whole page or something, that or they're withhold records entirely. That's like a good time to, if they keep insisting on the same exemptions, to ask for an in-camera inspection, because it can kind of be helpful. Like again, the supervisor doesn't like increase her authority by her reviewing the records, but when she's actually reviewed them and says, no, I still don't think you've provided enough information, I think it just like kind of makes it more like real, her opinion, because it's like I'm not just like going by what you wrote, like I actually saw the records myself. So I think it's helpful to ask for it, and it kind of shows like that you mean business too, like that you just the fact that
Yeah.
you know to ask for an in-camera inspection, like
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you
shows
for
that
this.
you're, yeah. I think there is information about how that process works in the guide, but um, I've like talked to people and they've been like, "Oh, I had no idea you could do that." So I think it's like helpful to tell people about that whenever you get the opportunity.
For sure. I had no idea. That is an awesome tool.
Well, again, not only do you tip your waitresses and your bartender, tip your local journalists because
Yes.
it's a good tip. And again, please go and check out Andrew's content and do what you can, whether it's give him money or or
Definitely give me money.
or give him money. But also at least subscribe and follow and get the word out. And we can get a lot of answers if we team up together. And that's all I can say. That's number one easiest way to get active is support a thriving journalist culture. And again, I'm spacing on numbers, but since like 2005, like 2,200 local newspapers had closed, and that's why people like George Santos and whoever these big scammers can get into as high places as Congress. It's because there's nobody doing the work, because that industry was choked out.
Actually, the George Santos thing, there was a local, I can't remember the name of the paper, but there was one local paper that was like onto him. But like, I guess it shows the importance of like when there is local journalism, the like bigger papers like the New York Times should be paying attention to it too. Cause,
Oh, absolutely. I'm not saying, but
but no, but you're totally right that yes, so many papers, including in Massachusetts, are closing or they're downsizing,
Yeah.
and it's really terrible. I think I, I've never seen The Wire, but I heard like a quote from one of the people who wrote the show. He's like a former investigative reporter. He was talking about like newspaper closures, and he was saying like, it's going to be a great decade for political corruption. Like if you want to be a corrupt public official, like now is a good time to get involved in the corruption because, your chances of getting caught by reporters are going down just because of like, you know, so many papers like are just being like hollowed out by these like vulture corporations. Like Gannett owns so many of the papers in Massachusetts. They merged with Gatehouse, which owned a lot of papers. That's the company that owns USA Today, and they're just like laying people off left and right, and like it's horrible, and like they barely pay people enough as it is, and like they're just like destroying journalism, which is like so harmful not just for people's jobs, but for communities, like not having access to basic information about like, what's happening at the school board or what's happening at, town hall or, the city council meeting or, whatever, like, what are the police up to these days? Like some places don't even have newspapers, and it's pretty bad. And, I don't know what the answer to that problem is, but I hope somebody figures it out someday.
Well,
Me-
we part of it is we got to talk about it honestly, and
Definitely.
it's good to have these conversations, and that could be a whole
And
another.
we have the tools to make records requests.
Yeah, certainly get involved yourself.
We
Like not everything has to be done by journalists, or like maybe in being involved in this process is what will make you want to become a journalist. That's kind of how it worked for me, is like I started doing like records requests and stuff, and I was like, wow, this is really cool that you can actually ask questions and then find out the answers. Like, like you don't have to be like a passive observer to history. You can be, involved in some way, shape, or form. Like just get involved, and like, maybe you'll find it isn't for you, but like give it a shot. Like just try it. Like you never know. Like finding out stuff through public records requests can be really um just really gratifying, and sharing the results of your requests can be gratifying and can help other people be more informed. And if you get pushback, like I was saying, just file an appeal. Like, even if you're not sure, like just try it out. Like it's worth a shot.
It's great advice, Andrew. Just try it out, everyone. Just do it. Just make the request, file the appeal, get the records, and join those of us who are potentially becoming journalists, because I feel the same way, Andrew. I don't consider myself a journalist at all, but the ability to ask questions, get the answers, ask clarifying questions, and then maybe know a bit more about what's going on in my community or what's happening around me. Definitely, like, not being a passive observer in that sense, and understanding is, it sometimes makes things just more easy to deal with. And sometimes it's depressing, but it's also like, I really want to know what's happening around me.
Yeah, so I mean, one reason Joanna and I started the Weed Out is because basically tons of corruption in Holyoke, and there's no interest in reporting on it. It's not even, it's just cartoonish how Holyoke is run, in my opinion. Well, not all of it. There's a lot of good things about Holyoke. I shouldn't disparage this wonderful town, because there are some wonderful people here. Most of them are wonderful, but in today's ghoulery and tomfoolery, Holyoke is unfortunately center stage. In the last weeks, Dusty Christensen at the Shoestring reported on complaints not being followed through on, and there was initially no response for comment from the police department nor the mayor's office. That led to Andrew doing some also adding to that story on his Substack. And then the mayor did ultimately respond to comment later to New England public media, and basically said, I don't know how you guys interpret it, but I heard he just reworded what the excuse was, is like, well, there was no evidence, so we didn't follow it up, therefore we closed it, and there was no reason to follow up. So it's actually kind of a miracle there's only 192 in that time frame, or whatever, a political spin where you say nothing. And then
just to clarify, I did write about this on my Substack, but I had nothing to do with like them commenting. Like
no. I was just giving a timeline of events.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I just want to make that clear that
Yeah,
I'm not taking credit for
no, absolutely not. No.
anything.
I just wanted to make sure, like, there is multiple vantage points that I saw, so I'm not just coming from this point of view on my own. This is based on my research from other people's work, and not shocking. Mayor Garcia is prone to talk in political speak, gibberish, stump speech kind of stuff. That's our experience with him so far. I think he ultimately means well, but he's embedded in the system of power, and I don't know. I have a lot to say about that, but that's a different episode. But basically, at the same time, the audit that he ordered to be conducted essentially by a consultant filled with ex-police and ex-FBI and ex-lawyers for the government, standard fare, friendly consultant, kind of like, think Office Space, like corporate friendly, but in this case law enforcement friendly, come in and basically say some really awful things, like they're keeping Holyoke, they're presenting Holyoke substantial risk based on their current policies and practices in our audit. And that's alarming, but it's also interesting that even in the consultants spin, or their take on it, was spend more money, more training, more money pit, and we're still going to have those problems, but at least you'll be compliant, and you won't have the FBI down your ass. That's basically how I read it, and through my, like, okay, what's this ultimately mean in the real world? I'm sure some people would nitpick on my analysis, and I would be more than happy to hear it. But that's the tomfoolery and ghoulery and all the shenanigans in Holyoke, and it's depressing because the city's got so much great potential, and that's basically why we started the Weed Out, is to hopefully do some small town punditry and journalism, and give power to the people. So I don't know what's before we go. I want to hear, I guess, Andrew's take first, and then Joanna, I would love to hear your take on the audit.
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, I have not read the actual audit report, but I did read like Dusty Christensen's reporting on it, and sort of I had like kind of a similar reaction, which was like, this is them saying that, I mean, some of the things they're acknowledging are real problems, but like the framing of it is like from this sort of like pro police stance where it's just like assumed that we need to have, you know, a big police department that is staffed at a certain level, instead of like sort of questioning the framework of saying this wasn't like a holistic review where they're saying, okay, well, the police have all these problems and they have all these complaints and they're not addressing them. And uh, so maybe policing isn't the answer to all our problems and we can divert some of this money away. And we, you know, instead it's like, oh, the police are so bad, they just need more people and more money and, you know, more stuff and like more oversight. And some more oversight might be helpful, but like it doesn't automatic, like having more police and more money in a police department doesn't translate automatically into like more safety. Um, and it seems like the audit was like one of these like really limited purpose, you know, things that was designed to come at it from a certain angle rather than to look at like the whole problem of policing in this country, which is maybe not surprising, but like I think that, you know, people are more wise to that now. Maybe not everyone, but a lot of people are. um, but I mean, I guess the one other thing I wanted to say about this is like to go back to Dusty's reporting about the complaints and how like I don't think any he looked at like 10 years of data, and I don't think any police officer was like actually what I would consider punished for anything they did.
Yeah.
There were like a couple times, I don't remember the exact numbers. It was there was a dispatcher who received a verbal warning and an officer who received another verbal warning and one officer who received some additional training. And like none of that I would classify as punishment. Like getting talked to is like, so what? And getting
Oh,
more
oh,
training, getting more
cop like being talked to.
yeah, by
Yeah.
another cop.
But even yeah, like the most triggering situation for all these dudes
Don't
would be
get caught next time, dumbass.
Yeah.
uh but yeah, and then the other thing is like more training, which I'm almost certain was probably paid training. Like, okay, like you give them some extra money, you know, basically to go learn something that they should have already known. Who cares? Like that's not punishment. That's just maybe you could call it disciplinary action, but it's certainly not like punishment. It's not like holding someone truly accountable when they've done something wrong. But um, they uh, all of this we found out because he did a public records request, you know, to go back to the theme of what we were
right.
talking about.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it also, he said it took, where was it? It took a year and a half to get all these records, which should have been provided a lot sooner. Um, but it just shows, going back to like persistence, like, you know, keep bugging them for the records you want, like over and over again. Like don't stop until you get the records. And eventually you might get something huge like this that, you know, if you're willing to keep fighting for it, like what Dusty did, just to like, you know, just to say like he did great work here. Like I read his story, I listened to the radio version. Like this is really great reporting. Like this is the kind of thing that like it takes so long to do that kind of reporting, but it's like the most meaningful kind of reporting that people do. And in this case, like in a lot of cases, it's because of public records and because, you know, someone was willing to be persistent and put in the time to get the records and review them and, you know, follow up on everything. And like people should just be aware that like this law has like, it has a really important function, and like we need it to be like as strong as possible so that people can get records like this, and so that ideally that it won't take them a year and a half. It'll, you know, maybe someday we can get police records like this just online, and, you know, you'll just be able to like go, search for an officer's name. But like until then, we need people who are willing to kind of like fight for this stuff.
Absolutely. And I have a similar take on the both issues as
Joanna, you weren't
I,
going to play spoiler? You weren't going to play spoiler?
what do you mean?
You weren't going to just buck us and be like, nah, actually, I approved this report. I'm just
Well,
teasing.
I've read I have more to say. So
No,
I've read the audit and to some degree, and my job is in research compliance, so I do understand some things, and in the audit,
you
um,
understand a lot. Dude.
I know, honey, I know that no one's saying that about me. I'm just saying for people out there, you may not work in research compliance, you may not understand what you're reading, and that's fine too. But what I take away from the audit, in fact, was that it was very much like if you go in as an industrial organizational agency and you're trying to do an audit, it's mostly on personnel and money and kind of things like Andrew said, like very basic. And I know like the community of Holyoke has been asking for years for a police audit that involved the people of their community as well. More, like Andrew said, like more holistic and really covering a lot more than just what it covered. What that came up with, kind of give them the money. And I don't want to exempt any town in Western Mass from the corruption. We did mention Holyoke, but shout out to Greenfield, Pittsfield, Montague, all y'all, Northampton. We need to keep track of all of the towns in Western Mass, in my opinion, and the records requests are a great way to do it. So I just want to, I personally hope that the Holyoke City Council, and this is my call to action for them, looks to the Greenfield City Council and how they review things and really thinks about the community, and with this audit pushes the mayor, who is related to police officers, and I didn't know that. So the Holyoke police, the Holyoke mayor Garcia has police members in his family, I recently heard. So unless that's not true, but I think it makes you more apt to also, because someone's involved in that in your family, you would have also a more closer tie to protecting that budget line. But I do want to remind people, like Andrew said, please be persistent. That's one of the biggest things that I have to remember to do sometimes. It can be hard, but you can set reminders or kind of have these templates ready. And please support our local journalists like Andrew with money, shares, follows, likes. And I guess that's all I have to say about that, really.
Yeah, actually, one thing just popped into my head talking about like sort of the more holistic reviews of policing. Like some communities actually have done stuff like this. Like I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I know that like Northampton had a report that was talking about creating like a community, like an unarmed community safety organization. Like there's other communities that have talked about like implementing these mental health like units that are separate from the police, and they've kind of had these like reviews that talk about like what is possible and like how they could implement it. And I'm not sure like in like the Northampton example, I'm not sure how far they went towards actually implementing it, but like just the possibility for like these reviews is there. Like they don't have to all be this like, well, talking about like is the police department like understaffed, like they can look at other issues like are the police even the people who are most qualified to be doing this work, and should we invest in other solutions. And I think it's important for people to like push for more broad a more broad look at things. So um I just wanted to mention that because it just popped in my head while you
No,
were talking about it.
that's a great mention.
So I agree with you, and I will say that Northampton, Amherst, Somerville is actually really pushing a lot of these policies to success. Places like Northampton really tried to split the baby with the neolibs in town, and they kind of, in my opinion, way underfunded this department, and it kind of set it up to flounder and not really get legs. And it's really, really sad and unfortunate. But I'm also heartened to hear the Northampton government is going after one of the worst landlords and starting to take his liquor licenses away. So, I mean, it's been a long time coming. So it's hard to gauge where the Northampton City Council or government's going to go forward, because they kind of were all talk the first 2 years of George Floyd, and then have kind of regressed and kind of more met in the middle. Joanna, would you agree with that assessment?
I just think good luck to the Northampton City Councilors during this budget season. They've changed the comments, so public comments, because they already know people are going to come very openly in that community, do public records and talk to them about the Department of Community Care. It is up and running, Andrew, but it is probably very much underfunded. And thank you for mentioning Amherst too, Spencer. Their CREST program is awesome, but I do agree with you.
There are communities doing it better than Northampton, and
Yes. I just think that
has should be held to a higher standard. They talk a big fucking game.
Oh yeah, the counselors should be prepared for comment coming up, because if anyone ever wants to watch some interesting city council meetings, Northampton are sometimes very long but very interesting. So just plugging that for if you're interested in local politics. Very interesting.
And it's really important for these cities to, with the ones that do have the political will behind it, to set a good example, and then we can learn from their programs. You know, it's abolition doesn't happen overnight, people. Whether we could snap our fingers and make it happen, but you know, to leave it on a hopeful note, part of it is through these public records requests. We wouldn't be able, without the data to prove that, look, cops are fucking bastards, guys. Like, there's people doing the work. You know, I like to stick with that because violence and the threat of state terror is real. It's palpable. You get pulled over, your heart skips a beat, even if you're the most benign person, you're a white-skinned man. Even if you're just the most milquetoast person, you're gonna, because you know, man, it doesn't matter. You could be just the wrong day, and it's built into our society, and it's really not okay. That is not ensuring a safe, prosperous society, as the Bill of Rights claims to address. So it's through the work of people like Andrew and Dusty Christensen, was mentioned multiple times, through his diligent work and your diligent work and others, the shoestring. And without that work, we'd live in a totalitarian state, and we don't currently, but this is how one way we can hold them off. So I just want to remind everybody that, and we can push for new things and hold our elected officials and bureaucrats responsible for their following to our policies. So I don't know more to say.
If people want to check out my stuff, my newsletter that I write is called The Math Dump, and the URL is andrewqmr.substack.com.
And of course, we're going to link that to our webpage too. So if anybody is just like wants to send their friends anything, it's all right there. We're trying to make it as simple as possible for everybody. We want to get Andrew's work out there. And thank you as always for tuning in. Andrew, thank you so much for being on our show, and we hope to have you back on to talk more.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This stuff that you have a knack for, and you're again, thank you for your expertise. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, and if anybody who listens to this does decide to make public records requests and stuff, my email is like on my newsletter. Feel free to reach out to me if you have like questions or something. I have lots of unread emails, but I will try to get to things that people send me. Most of my unread emails are actually like related to public records requests that I'm just like, oh my God, I have to like follow up on this, but I can't summon the energy to do it right now. But when people send me questions, I do try to answer them. So feel free to reach out.
And I would urge people to do the same to the weedout, because I can answer some questions. I may have to ask Andrew for you if it's a little confusing. But I guess on my side, like thank you, Andrew, as always. And I love when we get to talk about these things, because it just is hopeful. And I just want everyone to join us in public records requests. That's my kind of end all of this. Please join us in requesting public records.
All right, everybody.
Oh, and real quick, I don't know, this episode is probably coming up before then, but look around March 12th, the week of March 12th, it's called Sunshine Week. It's like this sort of like week when different news organizations around the country will participate. It's like a way of bringing attention to the importance of public records laws. So
Hmm.
you might see information about that in your local paper, or you might not. You might not even have a local paper, as we were saying earlier. But keep an eye out for that, and like if you don't see anything, maybe like write to the local paper and be like, hey, how come you didn't publish anything about public records this week? And unfortunately, hopefully the answer isn't like because we don't have enough people to write about it. But yeah, like it's definitely, I think that I've certainly heard this before, that like other journalists think that like writing about public records or transparency is boring, like to people. Um, like they may want to write about like the contents of the records, but they don't want to write sort of about like the nitty gritty, like the policy behind public records, or write about people giving them a hard time about public records because they think that people just don't find it that interesting. I mean, like let them know if you do think it's interesting and that you do want to hear about stuff like that, because I think that talking about that stuff more openly, just sort of about like the struggles that journalists go through to get information, can be a way for the public to kind of understand uh, more about how government works. And I think it's important for like trust in journalism, because obviously we have like this crisis of trust in the media right now, and I think to some extent, obviously it's complicated and there's no like one reason for it, but I think part of it is like people don't understand like what reporting is like they don't like, if you can, but you if you like explain the process, like we try to get records and sometimes we can't talk about things because they won't give us the records, and sometimes you know we you know etc. Like I think it kind of helps people to understand like this is how the media works, and they're doing their best most of the time, but like there can be a process behind what they do that isn't necessarily something you see out in public all the time, but that it's like it's the way they work, and like knowing that can make you more understanding
Absolutely.
and more sort of like media literate, I guess.
Well, as always, hope everybody checks out all this work online, and thanks for joining in with us, and we hope to see you next time. And Andrew, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care, everyone.